Hello, I'm Ciara Lynch and welcome to Teagasc, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode we bring latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. In the current episode we're going to focus on external parasite control and in particular the use of sheep dips. Firstly we're joined by Michael Gostein, Head of Sheep in Teagasc, who discusses the role sheep dip can play in external parasite control, how it can be best used and what are the key considerations we need to take into account when using both from a human and an animal point of view. In the second half of the podcast, we're joined by Kevin O'Sullivan, Asset Advisor with Teagasc, who discusses best practice when using sheep dip, both from dip procedure to the disposal of dip afterwards. I'm joined now by Michael Gostein, Head of Sheep in Teagasc. Michael, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you, Kieran.
Michael, I suppose we'll go to the topic of external parasites, and I maybe just want to focus for a few minutes. We've seen a resurgence and an increase in interest in dipping sheep in recent years. Maybe just give us a bit of background. Why is dipping a good means of control for external parasites?
Yeah, so I suppose plunge dipping is it was around years ago before we had pour-ons and spot-ons. The only option people really had was plunge dipping, and that time there was dipping tanks all around the country and people used to dip their sheep a number of times every year to control all the external parasites. So most of the dips are quite effective at controlling blowfly for a period of time after dipping, ticks, biting and sucking lice, and then sheep scab. Now, not all of the dips control ticks, but are licensed to control ticks as such. I suppose then we had lots of different pour-on formulations and injectable ivermectin type products or ivermectins, and the convenience of those kind of took over, and a lot of people, I suppose, stopped dipping for a number of years. And I think we've seen an increase in problems with, in particular, probably biting lice and sheep scab and difficulty in controlling those. So
you mentioned a couple of points we'll go back on, but you mentioned there we've different products for using in dips. Maybe you'll just outline what they are.
Yeah, so I mean there's lots of different dips on the market, but I suppose they all belong to one of two families of active ingredients. So the first one are the organophosphate. That's the oldest type dip that we have there, and that's the one, I suppose, that in the past, from a human health point of view, you need to be more careful with. So the organophosphate is the one that's really effective, I suppose, against sheep scab, biting and sucking lice, and blowfly. It's not licensed for use against ticks. The second type of active ingredient we then have is a cypermethrin. So that's an insecticide, and that particular product is very effective against all the external parasites. So you have your biting, sucking lice, your maggots and blowfly strike for a period of time after dipping, and also your ticks and your sheep scab.
So when you mentioned cypermethrin, that's one we typically see in a lot of the topical sprays that we can use. I'm thinking and you mentioned there about convenience. One of the other things we've seen an increase or more relying heavily on in the industry has been injectable ivermectins, particularly for scab control. But that poses its own challenge, particularly with resistance. The need to move away from that is really upon us now. Yeah,
so injectable macrocyclic lactones, or your ivermectins, your doramectins, or your moxidectins, they came about in the 80s, and they're effective against sheep scab and sucking lice if they're used properly. I suppose the challenge we have with those products is that we're now in a time when lots of they're also anthelmintics or wormers, and we're now seeing lots of resistance to the different anthelmintic classes on sheep farms. So what we're saying is really we don't want to be using an anthelmintic or a wormer when we don't need it to kill worms in sheep that are being production limited by that worm burden. So what I'm saying really is we shouldn't be going out and injecting every sheep with a macrocyclic lactone, either an ivermectin type product, a doramectin or a moxidectin type product. simply because we are selecting for worms that are resistant to that particular active ingredient. So that's the first reason why I suppose we should try to routinely avoid using injectable macrocyclic lactones for a scab control. I suppose the second thing that's coming up on that, and it's something that emerged in the last year or two from the UK, is that they have found sheep scab that is resistant to these injectable macrocyclic lactones. So not only is there an issue there now with worms being resistant, but we're also finding scab being resistant. So the effectiveness of that particular control method is being put into question, I suppose.
So the convenience of it was obvious, but there is that risk then for on two folds now. Look, not everybody's going to have a dip, so where you're in an area where scabbing is a risk, or you're buying in a store lambs and it's a risk, there are mobile dippers now going around the country offering a service on farms. How effective is that?
Yeah. So I think the important thing with dipping sheep is that, number one, we make up the dip solution correctly, so that we use the required amount of dip per 100 gallons of dip that we have in the dip wash. The second one is that as we start dipping the sheep, the wool of the sheep will absorb some of the active ingredient. So we need to replenish it after every 35 or 36 sheep for the smaller tanks, or might be 90 sheep for the bigger tanks. You'll follow the instructions that are supplied with the dip for that. So that's the second thing, is that we replenish it as directed. And then the third thing is that they're immersed in the dip solution for a suitable length of time. And that length of time is important because that's the time during which the dip, the active ingredient that's in this dip, either the cypermethrin or the organophosphate, is absorbed into the wool, and that's what gives us that residual activity and the ability to kill the parasites. So what we say for sheep scab, for dipping to be effective against sheep scab, the sheep need to be immersed in the dip solution for at least 60 seconds. So, you know, what we're talking about when we're talking about dipping sheep is primarily that it's dipping sheep. And as you mentioned, there's a number of mobile dippers, or a lot of mobile dippers around the country now. Some of those dippers have plunge dip bats, mobile plunge dip bats, and those are absolutely effective, provided that the initial concentration is appropriate and that it's topped up and that the sheep stay in it for 60 seconds each. There's also shower dipping units around the country, and those are not recommended from a scab point of view. There's actually no active ingredient that is licensed to put through those machines, and there's no work really done to show that they're effective against sheep scab. They're used quite a lot in New Zealand and Australia, where they don't have sheep scab. They eradicated sheep scab over 100 years ago in those two countries. So they're used in those countries primarily on bear shorn sheep, to control lice and maybe for a short period of time blowfly strike. So what we're saying really is it's dipping in a tub, either a mobile tub or a static dip tub on your farm, 60 seconds, right concentration, forget about showering.
Okay. Look, another point you made well at the beginning, and it's something worth remembering. These are chemicals we're handling, and personal protective equipment is important. You need to be well prepared when you are going to go dipping.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we look at the organophosphates, the older type dips, those are actually nerve agents that, would have been developed around World War One, and basically they affect the nervous system of the parasites on the sheep, and conversely they also affect us. So we don't want to be in contact with them. So really, protective equipment is important. A face shield when you're making it up. Only dip sheep outside, not in an enclosed area, because the vapors and the gases coming off it will affect you. And there are people in Ireland and other countries who have been adversely affected by sheep dip. So what we would be saying is, proper apron, Wellingtons, not leather, boots, gloves. Wash your hands and face if you accidentally get splashes on them. and in particular when you're handling the dip concentrate, the concentrated dip, to follow the instructions. All the dips now, the organophosphate dips, have dispensing mechanisms, so you can't just literally open the tin that you buy and pour it in. There's a special dispensing mechanism to basically put the dip into the dip tub for you without risking you coming in contact with it. So it's important that we use those.
It's essential you take care when you handle them.
Absolutely. The second dip, the type dip that is out there, is cypermethrin. Now cypermethrin is an insecticide. Again, we don't want to be coming unnecessarily in contact with it, but I suppose it's not, from a human health point of view, it's not as toxic, but that's not to say that we shouldn't be taking the same precautions. So really, people dipping, proper protective clothing, rainproof apron, face shield when you're putting in the concentrate, gloves and rubber boots.
And follow instructions.
And follow your instructions, yes.
Michael, maybe we'll finish up on one last bit. We'll talk about the prep of the operator. In terms of the preparation for the sheep coming into it, what kind of condition do you want them in for dipping?
Yeah, so when we're dipping sheep, really what we want is a dry day, and sheep that are rested and fasted for a period of time, just to reduce the amount of soiling around the dip and in the dip tub. So dry sheep that are settled, that aren't out of breath, that have a chance to settle down and that have been fasted for a period of time. And really we'd probably be looking for at least 24 to 48 hours of dry weather afterwards to allow that dip to dry into the fleece, so that the active ingredient can be absorbed into the wool and be retained there for a period of time.
Okay. Michael, thanks very much for that.
You're welcome.
I'm joined now by Kevin O'Sullivan. He's the Asset Advisor with Teagasc in County Kerry. Kevin, thanks for joining us.
You're very welcome, Kieran.
Kevin, earlier in the podcast we talked to Michael Gostein about the increasing usage of dip again and why we should be using dip as a means of external parasite control. Maybe if we take another approach to it, or look at another aspect of it, using dip where it's very effective, but it also has a potential environmental risk when it's used incorrectly. You might just take us through some of the key aspects of dipping procedure to protect the environment.
Yes, indeed, Kieran. I suppose, what Michael said about kind of the effectiveness of sheep dip, of course, what they're designed to do is they're insecticides, and they're very good at what they do. So we have to be careful that they don't get into water, because they'll do the exact same thing as water as they'll do in sheep. So because of that, the actual procedure around dipping is important, okay? So there's a few things I suppose we have to look at. First of all, the dipping tank area, is it sound? And also it's important that it's leak proof, so that there isn't any used sheep dip going to leak out of it during the process of dipping. We need to watch the weather forecast, that there's no rain forecast. Obviously you don't want to be dipping sheep if they're wet anyway, Once the sheep are dipped, okay, and they're held in the tank for the required period, you need to drain those sheep for what's recommended is about 10 minutes afterwards, so that there's no excess sheep dip on those sheep that can get into a watercourse afterward. You release them from the pen, okay? The pens will need to be concrete, of course, so that the used sheep dip is not going to go through a gravel floor and get into groundwater. Ideally, you'd want to prevent dipped sheep having access to drains or watercourses after dipping. So if you could have maybe a field, if there's a field alongside a dipping area that has no drain or watercourse in it, that's ideal, and they can be put into that, and once they're dried then they can be moved off. Or another option is maybe to house them for a period of time and let them dry off before you release them.
I think you made a key point there, like even in the use of mobile dippers, it's important to select your site carefully, that it's not in close proximity to a watercourse.
Exactly the same thing applies with mobile dips, Kieran, yeah. So I suppose they have the advantage in that you can actually select the site that you want to use them. So you could dip maybe in a field that there's no watercourse or drains in, and select that and perfect.
I suppose the other aspect, Kevin, when we have the sheep dipped, we also have to consider dip disposal. What's your recommendations on that?
Yeah, this is possibly the most important part of it, really, as regards dip disposal. So the first of all, I mean, if you don't dispose of the sheep dip and you leave it in the dipping tank, it's going to get into a watercourse, or it's going to get into a drain. It's going to overflow. So the first thing I would say on that, Kieran, is that if you haven't got means of disposal of sheep dip, you shouldn't be dipping maybe in the first place. Okay, now I'll run through what is the right way to dispose of it. The idea first to start with, wash the dipping area, okay, and collect all the washings and so on into the tank, okay. Then what you should do with the used sheep dip is mix it with a minimum of 1 to 3 parts with slurry or water, okay. So what you're looking at that is a use of a slurry tanker, okay.
So you're essentially just diluting out the dip that you're using.
Exactly, 1 to 3. So you can use either, okay, either slurry or water. So if you have slurry inside in a tank, you could fill it up with the sheep dip and put it in the top of it. Or if you have access to water, be careful with water now as regards don't go filling water maybe, and maybe inadvertently mixing sheep dip and water if you're sucking water out of a stream or something. So try and avoid that if you can, But once you've the mix made up, then the 1 to 3 mix of the used sheep dip and the slurry and water or whatever, you can spread that. Look at the figure that's probably easiest to remember is about 2,000 gallons per acre, okay? And what's recommended is that you spread that on the same area every year, because apparently what happens is that the microorganisms in the soil adapt to breaking down use sheep dip, and over a number of years they'll break it down easier or better, if you like.
And again, that area should be well away from any potential watercourse or seepage.
Absolutely, same thing applies again, Kieran. Yeah, that's absolutely it. Now, because you're using a slurry tanker, okay, and you're going to need a tractor and a tanker, not all dipping tanks are going to have accessibility for that. So you need to be careful maybe about considering using those in the first place at all.
Okay. And that goes back to your earlier point that it may not be suitable for every operator.
Absolutely. There is tanks, we see them kind of in our program, we come across tanks that, fair enough, when they were built, there wasn't an awareness of the environmental issues from sheep dip, but now we are becoming more aware of them. If they haven't got accessibility for disposing of the sheep dip, they probably should not be used. In fact, they definitely should not be used.
And Kevin, I'm just conscious, following dipping, like we have the containers to consider as well. Any advice on that?
Yeah, it's a thing where you could overlook, and because they're such good, effective chemicals and that sheep dips, we maybe could kind of forget about used containers or even lids of containers left around or thrown around maybe at dipping time. So if you think of these, you should dispose of these or use these something similar as if you were using say a spray can for a herbicide. So rinse them out 3 times, rinse the lids out as well, put the rinse into the dipping tank so they're cleaned out properly, and take the containers away and the lids away from the sheep dipping area and dispose of them properly. So look at, I suppose, Kieran, what we're trying to do, the kind of line on this is try and stop any drop getting into a watercourse or a drain if we possibly can. And I suppose the line on it is to stop every drop.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Some great advice there on the best practical advice for sheep dipping. Kevin, thanks for taking the time to join us.
Yeah, not at all, Kieran. You're very welcome.
We're going to finish the episode up at this point. I would like to thank both Michael and Kevin for giving up the time to be with us and offering their insights in both the role of sheep dip, how it can be best used, and some of the environmental considerations we need to take into account when using sheep dip, either in fixed units or mobile units. It is an area we're likely going to see a lot more frequently on farms in the coming years, particularly in lieu of developing resistance to injectable ivermectins. Again, for any other updates from the sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us in this episode of Movicast. Don't forget to subscribe and tune in to the next episode.